In the heart of the Aztec Empire, beneath skies so wide they seemed to press against the earth, there were men whose names never appeared in the songs of warriors or the codices of priests, yet whose lives were tangled into the deepest corners. Of palace intrigue men who are not soldiers, not nobles, not priests, but property, ornaments, and confidants, male concubines. Their existence was both visible and hidden, as if they were precious jewels locked inside a chest, admired when desired, forgotten when not. Tonight, I want to take you into the quiet chambers of one such man, a figure whose breath still lingers in the humid air of Tenochtitlan's vanished palaces. His name, in truth, is lost, but let us give him a name for the sake of closeness. Call him Xochipilli, Flower Prince, though he owned no kingdom and commanded no army. He was taken as tribute, as so many were, when his home city-state could no longer resist the pull of the Mexica's power, a human payment that was not just gold or cacao, but flesh, beauty, and youth. Imagine him as you lie in your bed now, perhaps with the sound of rain soft against your window, or the distant hum of a quiet street, his bare feet stepping across the cool volcanic stone floors, his thin cotton cloak brushing against his shins, the faint trace of copal incense lingering in the air, mixing with the scent of lime-plastered walls, warmed from the day's sun. Subscribe to this channel, if you haven't yet, so you can find your way back here again when the night feels too long. And tell me, quietly, where you're listening from, whether it's a small apartment in Karachi, a farmhouse in Texas, or a seaside town where the wind still smells of salt. Now close your eyes and let me guide you into his world. For the city outside his chamber is still awake, with canoes gliding along moonlit canals and the chatter of merchants closing their stalls in the great market of Tlatelolco. Inside the palace, though, the air is thick with stillness, except for the soft padding of servant feet and the low murmur of voices from behind reed mats. This was not the stillness of peace, but of anticipation, the kind that falls when you live as both an adornment and a hostage. Xochipilli's life began far from here, in a smaller alt-petal whose name no one in the palace cared to pronounce. He remembered a place where the air smelled of wet earth after rain, where women in brightly woven hooples laughed as they ground maize on stone metates, where festivals meant the beating of drums that echoed against the hills. But his city had resisted too long, and when the Aztec warriors came, their obsidian blades gleamed with a cold purpose. Tribute lists were drawn, and somewhere between the counts of maize sacks and feather bundles, someone added his name. He was chosen not for his skill with the spear, but for the curve of his face, the depth of his eyes, the smoothness of his skin, qualities that in another life might have meant nothing, but here meant the loss of everything he had known. The journey to Tenochtitlan had been long, through valleys where the sun burned the back of his neck, across lakes where the water reflected the sky so perfectly he felt he might fall into it. At night, they slept in temple courtyards under the watchful eyes of carved stone gods, whose faces never blinked. When he finally arrived, the city struck him with its impossible scale. Causeways stretching like arms across the lake, canals filled with canoes that slid like silent shadows, marketplaces overflowing with cacao, obsidian, salt, and the red-dyed feathers of tropical birds. But for all its beauty, Tenochtitlan was a city of rules, and he was entering the tightest circle of them, all the palace. The male concubines of the Tlatoani lived in a world defined by both luxury and peril. They were dressed in fine cotton, their skin scented with fragrant oils, their diets filled with maize tamales, turkey stew, and honey-sweetened cacao. Yet these comforts came with the knowledge that they were possessions, their lives dependent on the whims of those who owned them. The palace was a labyrinth, long corridors lined with murals of past conquests, gardens where night-blooming flowers opened under the moon, courtyards where fountains whispered into stone basins. The concubines were trained not just in the arts of pleasure, but in music, poetry, and the subtler craft of listening without speaking too much. They learned to read the tilt of a noble's head, the tone behind a casual question, the flicker of discontent in the eyes of a warrior returned from campaign. Xochipilli found that his survival depended on a smile that could hide exhaustion, a gaze that could flatter without becoming too bold. There were moments of odd tenderness in this life, an older concubine teaching him the right way to pour cacao so the froth rose high, a passing merchant slipping him a small pouch of amaranth, cakes in the market, a shared glance with another palace servant when a noble's temper boiled over. Yet there were also nights when he lay awake, staring at the woven mat above his bed, listening to the distant drums of the great temple, knowing that in the morning one of his companions might be gone, sent away as a political gift, punished for some imagined insult, or simply replaced. The Aztec court thrived on spectacle and control, and a concubine was both stage and actor in a performance he could never leave. Still, there was an undeniable beauty to the city, to the way sunrise painted the lake in molten gold, to the sound of flutes drifting from a distant balcony, to the feel of cool stone under bare feet as he walked the palace corridors before dawn. He learned to take his pleasures where he could, stealing a few moments in the palace gardens to watch the hummingbirds dart between the flowers, listening to the soft trickle of water in the fountains, letting the scent of blooming magnolia trees fill his lungs. There was power, too, in knowing that while he could not command armies, his presence could shift moods, smooth over tensions, or whisper influence into the right ears. And yet, beneath it all, there was the constant shadow of loss of a life. That might have been of a family he would never see again, of a freedom traded for survival. Tonight, as you listen, imagine the torchlight flickering along the painted walls, the soft brush of woven matting as it shifts in the breeze, the quiet hum of a city both ancient and alive. And know that while this is just the beginning of Xochipilli's story, the deeper we go, the more we will uncover the strange blend of beauty and danger that defined the life of a male concubine in the Aztec Empire. Tomorrow in this story's world will bring new demands, unexpected gifts, and whispers in the dark, and we will follow him there, into the next turn of the palace corridors, where both luxury and peril await. The morning after such nights in the palace often began not with sunlight, but with the muted sounds of life filtering through the reed mat servants' murmuring, as they swept the stone floors with bundles of stiff grass, the faint splash of water being poured from clay jars into basins, and somewhere far off, the hollow rhythmic beat of huedel drums from a temple courtyard. Xochipilli woke with the kind of slow reluctance common to those who know their day will be shaped by the whims of others. His sleeping mat was soft enough for comfort, woven thick and laid over a low cedar frame, but the faint scent of the tanned hide beneath always reminded him that even here, in the heart of grandeur, there was a world of trade and tribute that had delivered every object into the palace. He rose quietly, wrapping his white cotton tilmatli around his shoulders, feeling the fine weave between his fingers, a weave so tight it could only have come from the best tribute weavers of the valley. Outside his chamber, the palace stirred like a waking animal, each courtyard and corridor coming alive in waves. To the east, the sun was just lifting over the distant mountains, and its first light caught on the mica-studded plaster of the palace, walls making them shimmer like the scales of a giant fish. He passed through a hallway where painted murals showed the conquests of the Mexica, jaguar warriors with obsidian clubs, temples aflame, processions of bound captives. He often wondered if the palace artists painted such scenes to remind people of the empire's power, or simply to remind the palace's own inhabitants that they, too, were part of that display. This morning, his duties were unclear. Some days he would be summoned to the music rooms, where he and others would practice soft melodies on clay flutes, the kind of music that soothed the Tlatoani after council meetings. Other days, he might be required to accompany a noblewoman to the gardens, offering polite conversation, eyes lowered, ears open for whatever small details might later be repeated in the right place. And then there were the days when he was called, for no reason he could guess, led into a chamber heavy with incense, where his role was simply to be present. A reminder, perhaps, of loyalty from a conquered city, or a gift meant to flatter a visiting dignitary. The palace was a place of beauty, but it was also a place where every gesture meant something, and Xochipilli had learned to measure his words like kernels of maize, careful not to scatter them in the wrong direction. Today, the air was heavy with the scent of roasting cacao, and his stomach turned with a mix of hunger and unease. In the main courtyard, gardeners tended to the ahuiwei trees, whose drooping branches made green curtains over the stone paths. Pair of young pages swept fallen petals into neat piles while keeping a wary eye on the palace stewards, whose sharp glances could cut as deep as any blade. As he passed the aviary, the cries of exotic birds filled the air. Scarlet macaws, bright green quetzals, parrots that could mimic human speech in uncanny bursts. The aviary keepers, older men with weathered hands, fed the birds bits of fruit. And insects, their movements slow and deliberate, as though tending to sacred beings. And perhaps they were, for in the Aztec worldview, every creature had its place in the cosmic order, and even the smallest hummingbird could be a messenger of the gods. Xochipilli paused there longer than he should have, letting the colors and calls of the birds wrap around him like a shield against the day's demands. But his moment of stillness was broken when a fellow concubine, Xochipilli, appeared at his side. Xochipilli had been in the palace longer, his manner smooth as polished. Obsidian, his smile a mask that hid as much as it revealed. "They'll want you in the feather workshop today," he murmured, eyes scanning the courtyard. "The Tlatoani is preparing gifts for the priests." Xochipilli nodded, understanding the implication. Gifts for priests meant lavish feather. Mosaics, and lavish mosaics, meant the concubines would be called upon to sit among the artisans, ensuring that the work remained flawless, and perhaps serving as quiet, living symbols of the empire's wealth and reach. The feather workshop was a place of astonishing beauty and quiet tension. Inside, artisans bent over their work, tweezers in hand, pressing delicate slivers of turquoise and emerald plumage into beeswax-coated boards. The air was rich with the smell of the wax, mingled with the faint musk of the feathers. Here, Xochipilli's role was not to touch the work, but to observe, to smile, to offer a word of admiration that could be carried back to the ruler himself. It was a strange form of labor, neither fully ornamental nor entirely practical, yet essential to the smooth flow of palace life. He sat on a woven mat near the window, watching sunlight spill across the feathers so they seemed to glow from within. As the hours passed, he found his mind drifting to the lake beyond the palace walls, to the causeways that stretched toward the horizon, to the markets he could no longer wander freely. He thought of the women in his home city who once teased him for being too careful with his hair, of the way the maize fields smelled at dusk, of the simple joy of sitting by a fire without worrying who might be watching. These memories came to him less often now, but when they did, they carried a sharpness that no amount of palace luxury could dull. By midday, the feather workshop's quiet hum was broken by the sound of footsteps measured, deliberate, the kind that made people straighten their backs. A steward entered, his eyes passing over the artisans before settling on Xochipilli. "You're wanted in the Hall of Mirrors," he said, his voice neutral. The Hall of Mirrors was not a place he liked to visit. It was a long chamber lined with sheets of polished obsidian, each reflecting the room in deep, shadowy tones. Here, the Tlatoani sometimes held private audiences, away from the grand public halls. As he followed the steward through the palace, The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, each turn taking him deeper into the maze of walls and courtyards. In the Hall of Mirrors, the air was cooler and the light dim. The ruler sat at the far end, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp. Around him stood a handful of advisors, their faces unreadable. Xochipilli approached, bowed low, and waited. The Tlatoani spoke of small things at first, the quality of the last feather mosaic, the ripeness of the cacao beans from a recent tribute shipment. But beneath the surface, there was always something more, a test of composure, a weighing of worth. When the audience ended, Xochipilli was dismissed with a wave, no explanation given. He walked back through the corridors, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. The palace could make a man forget who he was before, but it never let him forget what he was now. And as the afternoon sun deepened, he knew that whatever the next day brought, it would be shaped not by his own will, but by the currents of a world where beauty and danger flowed together like the canals that cradled the great city. Somewhere in those currents, he sensed, something was shifting, and tomorrow might carry a summons unlike any he had known before. That night, long after the last torches had been dimmed, and the palace's winding corridors had settled into their deep hush, Xochipilli lay awake, the faint rustle of the reed mat above his head blending with the whisper of wind slipping through the lattice screens. He could not shake the sensation that the Hall of Mirrors had not truly released him, that its shadow lingered here in his chamber, pressing against his thoughts like the cool weight of polished obsidian. Sleep, when it came, was thin and restless, tangled with half-formed images of the lake glimmering under moonlight, of faceless figures watching him from the edges of a garden, of the Tlatoani's gaze holding his like a hand that would not let go. Before dawn, a soft knock at his door roused him. The knocking was cautious, almost hesitant, as though the one on the other side feared to disturb the air too suddenly. When he slid the reed mat aside, he found a palace page no older than 12, clutching a folded strip of a mate paper sealed with red wax. The boy said nothing, just bowed and hurried away, his bare feet silent against the stone floor. Xochipilli turned the paper over in his hands, feeling the faint ridges of the wax seal, the dryness of the bark fiber beneath his fingers. Inside, the message was simple. Be in the south garden before the second drum. No name, no signature, but he knew. Enough of the palace's rhythms to understand this was not an invitation to ignore. The south garden lay beyond a series of narrow walkways and low archways, far from the bustling central courtyards. By the time he arrived, the sky was lightening from indigo to pale gold, and the first drumbeats were echoing from the great temple. The garden was nearly empty, except for a thin mist clinging to the air, softening the edges of the awiyat trees and the stone basins where water lily floated, their white petals half closed. On a stone bench near the far wall sat an older concubine, one Xochipilli had seen only in passing a cattle, whose hair was streaked with silver, despite the still youthful lines of his face. A cattle's presence was a rare thing. He moved through the palace like a shadow, trusted by some, avoided by others. Without looking up, he spoke. "They are watching you now," he said, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the stillness. More than they were before. Xochipilli stood very still, the damp air clinging to his skin. Why? A cattle's gaze shifted toward him, sharp and assessing. Because you're not just a gift anymore. You've been here long enough to learn the palace's rhythms, long enough to be useful in ways that go beyond what they took you for. His words were not unkind, but they carried a weight that settled into Xochipilli's chest. A cattle told him of others who had been drawn into more delicate roles, listening at feasts, delivering casual remarks to visiting nobles, carrying messages that were not meant to be written down. The palace was not only a place of pleasure and ceremony, It was also a web of quiet currents, and those who could move between its strands without drawing attention were valued in ways that could both protect and endanger them. As they spoke, the garden began to wake birds stirring in the branches, the distant splash of water as gardeners tended to the lily basins, the scent of damp earth rising in the warmth of the morning. A cattle's voice softened. "If they call you to the Hall of Mirrors again, remember, every reflection hides another behind it." With that, he rose, his cloak trailing across the dew-speckled grass, and disappeared down a side path that led deeper into the gardens. Xochipilli stood for a long moment, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps before turning back toward the main palace. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of ordinary duties, carrying a tray of cacao cups to a council chamber, helping arrange fresh mats in the audience hall, delivering a folded cloak to one of the Tlatoani's wives. Yet, each task felt as though it carried an extra layer now, a quiet test he could not quite define. In the afternoon, he was sent to the lakefront pavilion, where the ruler's canoe was being prepared for a ceremonial journey to one of the lake's island temples. The pavilion smelled of cedar wood and lake water, the air cool and damp as attendants polished the canoe's carved serpent prow. He stood to the side, watching the light play across the water, thinking of the journey he had taken here years ago, and how different the city looked now from when he first arrived. Back then, the palaces had seemed untouchable, the canals endless, the markets a marvel of noise and color. Now he knew their shadows as well as their beauty. As the sun dipped low, the Tlatoani himself appeared, his cloak heavy with turquoise and gold embroidery, his headdress crowned with quetzal plumes that swayed like slow flames. His eyes passed briefly over Xochipilli, lingering for just a fraction too long before moving on. That night, the palace was alive with the afterglow of the day's ceremony's distant flutes, a soft hum of conversation drifting from the feasting halls, the rich scent of roasting maize and chiles curling through the corridors. Yet Xochipilli found no comfort in it. In his chamber, he lay on his mat, tracing the patterns of light and shadow on the ceiling, wondering if a cattle's warning was a threat, a kindness, or both. Somewhere in the palace, behind the locked doors of the Hall of Mirrors, or in the whispered exchanges between nobles, decisions were being made, and he could feel that his place in this world was shifting, slowly but surely, toward something that might one day ask of him more than he had ever been willing to give. The summons came not with the cautious knock of a page this time, but with the abrupt arrival of two palace guards whose obsidian-tipped spears gleamed faintly in the torchlight. They did not speak until Xochipilli had risen from his mat, tying his telmatli tightly over his shoulders. "You are wanted," the taller one said, his voice a low rumble that gave no hint of the reason. There was no direction to refuse, and so he followed them, bare feet whispering against the cool stone as they moved through the dim corridors. It was deep in the night, that strange hour when the palace seemed to exist in two worlds, at once half asleep yet fully alert, every shadow alive with possibilities. They led him not toward the Hall of Mirrors, but to a part of the palace he had only glimpsed from a distance, the upper terraces overlooking the great temple precinct. The air grew cooler as they ascended, carrying the faint scent of burning copal drifting from the temple's altars, and far below he could see the lake reflecting the moon like a vast sheet of hammered silver. The terrace was guarded by silence, broken only by the rustle of the plumes in the headdresses of the figures waiting there. Among them was a high priest, his face painted in black and red, his eyes sharp and searching. He studied Xochipilli for a long moment before speaking, as though weighing more than just his appearance. "You are to serve at tomorrow's offering," he said finally, "not as the offering, but as the one who presents it." Xochipilli's breath caught in his throat, though he did not allow it to show. To present an offering at the great temple was an honor in name, but in reality it was a role steeped in risk. It meant standing in the sight of the gods, the nobles, the warriors, and the priests, carrying a gift that might be anything from precious jade to a living captive. It meant being seen, remembered, and perhaps judged. The high priest gave no further explanation, only dismissed him with a gesture, and the guards led him back through the winding corridors, their silence unbroken. Sleep was impossible after that. He lay in the dark, listening to the faint crackle of the torch outside his chamber, his mind turning over the possibilities. What was the offering? Why him? Was this the shift a cattle had warned of? Dawn came slowly, a pale wash of light that turned the palace walls to soft gold. The day moved with the careful precision of ceremony attendants scrubbing the courtyards, servants polishing obsidian blades, stewards hurrying from chamber to chamber with baskets of flowers, cacao, and incense. Xochipilli was dressed in a white cotton cloak edged with turquoise embroidery, a feathered headband set lightly against his brow. He was not told what he would carry until the moment came. In the temple courtyard, with the crowd murmuring like the low tide, a priest placed into his hands a small wooden cage. Inside, a hummingbird darted frantically, its iridescent feathers flashing blue and green in the morning light. For Xochipilli, the priest murmured, as if the god of the sun and war needed reminding. The hummingbird was sacred to the Mexica, believed to be the spirit form of fallen warriors, and releasing it before the temple's altar was a gesture heavy with meaning. As Xochipilli stepped forward, the crowd's eyes followed him not with the hungry appraisal of court banquets, but with a silence that seemed to press against his skin. The temple's steps rose before him, steep and shadowed, and the drums beat slowly, each strike like the pulse of the earth itself. He climbed, the cage light in his hands, yet waited with the eyes upon him, the air thick with incense, and the sharp scent of fresh-cut flowers laid on the steps. At the top, the high priest waited, flanked by two warriors in jaguar pelts. Xochipilli knelt, lifted the cage high, and with the priest's nod, opened the door. The hummingbird burst forth in a blur of wings, vanishing into the sunlit sky, leaving only the faint rustle of its passing. The crowd below exhaled as one, and the drums quickened, their rhythm swelling into the chants of the priests. As he descended, the murmurs began, some admiring, some curious, and some, he sensed, calculating. Back in the palace, the rest of the day passed in a strange floating haze. Wherever he went, people's eyes lingered on him a heartbeat longer than before. He caught fragments of conversation in the corridors, his name spoken quietly, comparisons, drawn to others who had once stood on the temple steps in similar roles. Some of those men had risen to favored positions in the palace. Others had vanished without a trace. That night, in the quiet of the concubine's quarters, Xochipilli came to sit beside him. "You've been marked," he said softly, not unkindly. "Now they will test how far you can be pushed before you break." Xochipilli looked at him, trying to read the layers beneath the words, but Xochipilli only gave a small, wry smile before slipping away into the shadows. Left alone, Xochipilli thought again of the hummingbird's sudden flight, of how it had vanished into the sky without hesitation. And he wondered not for the first time if freedom always meant escape, or if sometimes it meant learning how to move, unseen but unbroken, within the gilded cage. Yet somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the calm surface he wore like a second skin, he felt the slow turning of the palace's wheels, drawing him toward something he could neither see nor avoid, not in the days following the offering at the great temple. The palace seemed to hum differently around Xochipilli, as if some invisible current had shifted beneath the surface. It was not a loud change. No one announced it. No steward handed him a new title. But he felt it in the way the guards at certain doorways now allowed him to pass without question. in the way the older concubine's conversations would pause. Briefly when he entered, in the faint weight of glances that measured rather than merely admired. The morning began with the usual rituals. The soft sweep of palm fronds over the stone floors, the scent of steaming atoll drifting in from the kitchens, the distant boom of the temple drums marking the opening of the city's market. Yet when a summons arrived, it was not from the concubine's overseer, but from the chief steward himself, man whose voice was never raised, but whose orders could shift the palace like the turning of a great wheel. Xochipilli was to accompany a small party of noble visitors on their tour of the palace gardens. The request seemed harmless, even pleasant, but in the palace, harmless tasks often carried hooks beneath their smooth surfaces. The gardens were among the palace's most prized spaces, a carefully tended array of terraces filled with medicinal herbs, fruiting trees, and flowers gathered from the farthest edges of the empire. There were pools fed by aqueducts, were golden. Fish glinted in the sunlight, and shaded arbors where the air was thick with the perfume of blooming magnolia. As the visitors, a pair of lords from the eastern provinces and their wives, wandered among the paths, Xochipilli's role was to speak when spoken to answer their questions about the palace's splendor, and to guide them toward the spots where the ruler wished their attention to linger. Yet the true test lay in what he could notice while doing so. The flicker of interest when one lord saw the herb beds, the subtle tension between the two wives when their gazes crossed, the faint shift in tone when the conversation turned toward recent tribute demands. Every smile, every pause in his step was a thread in the quiet weaving of information. At one pool, the visitors lingered to watch the fish, and one of the wives, draped in a cloak embroidered with red shell patterns, turned to him with a question about the temple's rituals. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were sharp, and he knew she was not asking out of idle curiosity. He answered with the care of a man walking a narrow causeway above deep water, offering enough detail to satisfy without revealing more than the palace would allow. Later, when the group paused in the shade of the ahuehuet trees, a servant appeared with cacao and amaranth cakes. Xochipilli poured the drinks with the slow, graceful movements he had been taught, aware of how even the angle of the vessels tilt could be read as a reflection of the palace's hospitality. When the visit ended, one of the lords gave him a slight nod, a gesture so small it could have been missed. Yet in the palace, it might mean the difference between trust and suspicion. Back in the concubine's quarters, Xochipilli was waiting. "You handled them well," he said without preamble, his tone neutral. "But remember, when someone asks about the temple, they are never only asking about the temple." He spoke as if reciting an old truth, and perhaps he was. That night, Xochipilli found himself summoned again, this time to a small audience hall lit only by oil lamps. The ruler was there, along with 2 advisors and a scribe. They questioned him about the garden tour, what the visitors had admired, what they had asked, what they had left unsaid. He answered carefully, feeling each word weighed in the silent air. When it was over, the ruler dismissed him with a faint smile that revealed nothing of his thoughts. As he stepped back into the corridor, the quiet felt heavier than before. The palace had many games, and he had just been moved further onto the board. In the following days, his duties shifted subtly. He was sent to the market at Tlatelolco with a small entourage, ostensibly to select fine cloth for the palace stores. In truth, he suspected, the errand was as much about what he might overhear as it was about the cloth itself. The market was a sea of color, and sound traders calling out their goods. The scent of roasting maize mixing with that of fresh fish, stalls piled high with cacao beans, obsidian blades, woven mats, and bright feathers. As he lingered at one stall, pretending to inspect a roll of cotton, he caught fragments of conversation between 2 merchants about tensions in a northern province, the kind of information that would be carried back to the palace like a bird bringing news to its nest. That evening, when he returned, he was asked very casually about the quality of the cloth, and also, almost as an afterthought, about the general mood in the market. His answers were recorded by the same silent scribe who had been present. In the audience hall, each small task, each quiet question, seemed to lead deeper into a role he had not chosen, but could not refuse. Yet amid this new undercurrent of responsibility, life in the palace continued with its strange blend of beauty and unease. In the evenings, he still walked the garden paths when he could, feeling the cool stone under his feet, listening to the soft rush of water in the fountains. He still took small pleasure in the aviary, watching the quetzals and macaws shift in their cages, their bright feathers catching the last light of the day. But now, even these moments carried a shadow and awareness that somewhere, someone might be watching him watch the birds, noting where his attention lingered, what caught his interest. It was a life balanced on the fine edge between ornament and instrument, and he sensed that the day was coming when that edge would cut more deeply than he wished. For now, he told himself, it was enough to keep walking the narrow causeway, one measured step at a time, even as the waters on either side began to darken. The first sign that the nature of his assignments had shifted came with an errand that seemed, at least on the surface, too small for the attention it was given. It was a late afternoon heavy, with the smell of rain-thick clouds hanging over the lake, the air damp and charged. Xochipilli was summoned to the quarters of the chief steward, who handed him a sealed pouch no larger than his palm. "Take this to the West Pavilion," the steward said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Give it only to the one who asks for it by name. Do not open it. Do not let it leave your hand until then." Such instructions were not unusual in the palace, where small objects often carried great meaning, but the weight in the steward's gaze made it clear this was more than a simple delivery. Xochipilli crossed the palace's courtyards, the sky above darkening as the first distant roll of thunder echoed from the mountains. The West Pavilion was a quieter corner of the complex, a place where visitors from far provinces were sometimes lodged. As he approached, the rain began a slow, heavy fall that turned the stone paths slick and deepened the green of the garden leaves. Inside the pavilion, the air smelled of damp cedar. Only a few attendants were present, their eyes flicking toward him and away again. He waited by the open archway, listening to the patter of rain on the roof tiles, until a man in a deep blue cloak appeared. The man's face was lean, his hair bound with a strip of leather, and when he spoke, his voice was low and direct. He asked for the pouch by name. Xochipilli handed it over, noting the man's hands scarred in the way of warriors, yet steady as he took the parcel. No further words were exchanged, and the man vanished down a side corridor, leaving only the faint echo of his footsteps and the smell of rain. When Xochipilli returned, the steward asked no questions, only nodded once and dismissed him. That night, as he lay on his mat, the memory of the man's scarred hands lingered, along with the thought that he had just carried something whose significance he might never know. The following days brought similar tasks, delivering messages, guiding visitors along specific routes, being present at gatherings where his role was to listen more than speak. Some assignments were wrapped in ceremony, others in utter simplicity, but all carried the same unspoken thread. He was being trusted to carry things, words, objects, impressions through the palace without leaving visible traces. Yet trust in the palace was never pure. It was a tool sharpened to serve its wielder's ends. One evening, as the sun slid low over the lake and painted the walls in gold and rose, Xochipilli joined him on the garden path. "You understand," he said, not looking at Xochipilli, "that each of these tasks is a measure. They are watching for hesitation, for error, and for the smallest sign that you know more than you should." His words were calm, almost lazy, but Xochipilli heard the warning beneath them. The next test came sooner than expected. At dawn, he was summoned to the Hall of Shells, a long, cool room where the walls were inlaid with mother-of-pearl that caught the morning light in shifting patterns. There he found not the ruler, but two senior advisors, their expressions unreadable. They instructed him to accompany a delegation to the marketplace and remain close to one particular merchant's stall. He was not to speak to the merchant unless spoken to. He was not to buy anything. He was simply to observe and return before the midday drum. The market was already alive when they arrived, rows of stalls bright with woven cloth, baskets of red chiles, heaps of cacao beans, polished obsidian knives catching the light. The air was thick with the scent of roasting maize and fresh-cut herbs, the calls of traders rising over the steady murmur of the crowd. Xochipilli moved through it, like a shadow, keeping the merchant in view as he haggled with customers. There was nothing remarkable in the man's appearance, broad-shouldered, middle-aged, his hair tied neatly, his voice carrying just enough authority to command respect without inviting attention. Yet Xochipilli noticed the way certain buyers approached with no goods in hand, exchanged only a few quiet words, and left without making a purchase. Each time, the merchant's hand dipped briefly below the counter, as if touching something unseen. By the time the delegation left, Xochipilli had not spoken a word, but his mind was heavy with the images he would carry back. In the Hall of Shells, the advisors listened to his account with the stillness of carved statues, then dismissed him without comment. The lack of reaction was, in its own way, more unsettling than open praise or reprimand. That night, the palaces. Usual sounds, the distant flutes, the drip of water in the garden basins, felt sharper, as though the air itself was listening. He understood now that his position was not simply shifting. It was narrowing, drawing him into a corridor with fewer doors to step aside through. The gilded cage had begun to tilt, and the ground beneath his feet was no longer as steady as it once seemed. And yet, part of him, quiet, watchful, was learning how to move within it, to keep balance even as the shadows grew longer and the space to breathe became smaller. The invitation, when it came, was disguised as an instruction, written in the clean, precise hand of the chief steward and delivered by a page whose eyes did not quite meet his. Attend the moon court this night. Bring nothing. Speak to no one until spoken to. Xochipilli had heard whispers of the moon court, though never in more than a fragment hushed mentions from older concubines, the kind of talk that trailed off when someone entered the room. It was said to be a gathering that met only when the moon was a narrow crescent, a private assembly of the ruler's most trusted circle, where decisions were made in shadows before they ever appeared in daylight. That evening, the palace corridors seemed longer, the flicker of torchlight more watchful. He was led by two silent guards through a series of increasingly narrow passageways, their walls of smooth, cool stone absorbing the sound of their steps. They emerged into a courtyard he had never seen before, small and enclosed, with a single pool in its center, reflecting the faint crescent moon overhead. The air was thick with the scent of burning copal, and the only sound was the slow, steady drip of water from a carved serpent's mouth into the pool. Around the edges of the courtyard stood perhaps a dozen figures, advisors, priests, and a few who wore no formal insignia, yet carried themselves with the authority of those accustomed to power. In the center sat the Tlatoani himself, his cloak of white cotton catching the moonlight, a jaguar pelt cushion beneath him. No one acknowledged Xochipilli's arrival beyond a brief glance from the steward. He took his place where he was directed, slightly behind and to the side of the ruler, close enough to hear, but far enough to be ignored if it suited them. What followed was not the grand oratory of the council halls, but a slow exchange of low voices, the rhythm of conversation punctuated by long silences. Matters of tribute from distant provinces were discussed. The need to reinforce certain garrisons, the appointment of a new priest to the Temple of Tlaloc. Then the talk turned, almost imperceptibly, to names some he knew, others unfamiliar spoken, in tones that suggested debts owed, alliances tested, and a careful weighing of loyalty. At one point, the ruler gestured toward him without looking. He saw the merchant, the Tlatoani said simply, and the advisors nodded as if this confirmed something already suspected. A priest asked him a single question, whether the merchant's stall had been busy with trade. Xochipilli answered with the same measured calm he had carried in the marketplace, and no further inquiries were made. Yet he felt the ripple of his. Words passed through the group, subtle but unmistakable, as though each of them had filed away the detail for their own purposes. The moon court lasted until the moon itself had set, the courtyard lit only by the dull red glow of braziers. When it ended, the assembly dispersed in silence, each member vanishing into the palace's network of corridors as though they had never been there. The guards led him back a different way than they had brought him, the turns and stairways impossible to map in his mind. By the time he returned to his chamber, the first pale light of dawn was brushing the tops of the palace walls. Sleep was impossible. He sat by the small lattice window, watching the city below stir into life, the faint movement of canoes on the lake, the smoke curling from the cooking fires in the common districts, the calls of the first traders heading toward Tlatelolco. He thought of how the moon court's voices had blended into one another, indistinct yet heavy with consequence, and how his own presence there had been both marginal and central, a silent observer who had, in a single sentence, become part of the thread they were weaving. For the next 2 days, no summons came. He returned to the small routines of palace life, attending the aviary, helping arrange the feather cloaks in the audience halls, offering polite words to visiting nobles. But the quiet was not the comfort it might once have been. It felt instead like the pause before rain, a moment when the air is heavy and the ground seems to hold its breath. Itzcoatl, ever perceptive, found him in the gardens one afternoon, plucking a blossom from a magnolia tree. "They've let you into the moon's shadow," he said softly. "But the shadow moves. You'll have to follow it, or it will leave you behind." He placed the blossom in Xochipilli's hand and walked away without another word. That night, lying awake beneath the faint creak of the reed mat, Xochipilli thought of the pool in the moon court courtyard, of how it had held the reflection of the crescent moon so perfectly, yet would be empty in the morning. He wondered if that was what this new role would be, brief moments of reflected light, each vanishing before he could fully grasp their shape. And yet, deep within, it was the quiet recognition that such reflections, however fleeting, had the power to change the course of the water beneath them. The second summons to the moon court came sooner than he expected, carried not by a page or a guard this time, but by a cattle himself, whose sudden reappearance was as disquieting as the message he bore. "Tonight," a cattle said simply, his eyes holding Xochipilli's a moment, longer than comfort allowed. "And this time, you will not only listen." Those words lingered like incense smoke long after a cattle had gone, seeping into Xochipilli's thoughts as he moved through the day's shallow routines. He polished obsidian mirrors in the Hall of Shells, accompanied a noble woman to the aviary, sat in the garden while scribes read aloud the poetry of Xochipilli. Yet all the while, the knowledge of what was coming threaded through him like a taut cord. The moon was once again a narrow curve when the guards came for him, their obsidian-tipped spears gleaming faintly in the torchlight. This time, their path to the moon court seemed shorter, though perhaps it was only his anticipation that made it so. The same small courtyard awaited pool at its center, serpent's mouth dripping water in slow, measured drops, but tonight there was an added stillness. the kind that arrives when those gathered know something will be decided. The Tlatoani sat in his place, his white cloak luminous under the moonlight, and beside him lay a folded piece of deerskin parchment, heavy with red wax seals. When Xochipilli took his position behind and to the side, the ruler spoke without looking at him. "You will carry this," he said, his voice even but edged with weight. "It will leave the palace by your hand, and it will reach the Temple of the Wind without delay." The Temple of the Wind Ehikautl's sanctuary stood on the far edge of the sacred precinct, its round walls and conical roof designed so the wind would swirl around them, carrying prayers skyward. The walk there would pass through narrow passages between the palace and the temple courts, spaces where shadows gathered thick and listening ears might wait. Xochipilli took the folded parchment, feeling its stiffness, the faint raised texture of whatever was written within. No one explained its contents. No one needed to. In the Moon Court's world, the act of carrying was itself a statement, and the choice of who carried it was another. The ruler dismissed him with a gesture, and 2 guards fell in at a distance, not to guide him, but to follow their presence. More a warning than protection. The night air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp earth from the gardens and the sharper tongue of incense drifting from unseen altars. The city beyond the palace walls murmured in the distant soft laughter. From the canals, a faint beat of a drum marking some small feast, the splash of a paddle dipping into the lake. He passed through corridors lit only by the occasional oil lamp, the walls close enough in places that his fingertips could brush the cool plaster. At the temple, 2 priests waited at the entrance, their feathered headdresses swaying in the breeze. They accepted the parchment without a word, their eyes flicking briefly to his before turning away. The exchange was wordless, but the air around it seemed to thrum, as if the delivery had set something unseen into motion. On his return to the palace, the guards peeled away without explanation, leaving him to walk the last stretch alone. The Moon Court had already dispersed by the time he reached the courtyard, its pool empty of moonlight, now that the crescent had sunk below the walls. He found Akidal waiting for him near the entrance to his chambers. "You did well," the older man said, though his voice carried no warmth. "But understand each time they choose you for a task like this, it is not only trust, it is a tether. And the tighter it draws, the harder it is to move without their hand on it." That night, sleep did not come. He sat by the lattice window, watching the faint flicker of torches along the causeways, the slow drift of canoes across the water. He thought of the sealed parchment in his hands, of how little he knew of its words, and of how much weight they might carry. In the palace, he was learning. Silence could be as dangerous as speech, and a man could be bound just as tightly by what he was never told as by what he was. The summons to the ruler's private chambers came without the usual ceremony, no guard, escort, no formal parchment, only a quiet word from a kitchen servant who appeared at the door of the concubine's quarters just after sunset. "Now," she said, her voice low, her eyes darting toward the corridor as if wary of being seen. Lingering. Xochipilli rose at once, his pulse quickening though his expression remained calm. The path to the inner chambers was one few in the palace walked freely. It wound through a series of low, dimly lit corridors lined with murals of mythic battles. Their jaguar and eagle warriors frozen in eternal combat, the obsidian blades in their painted hands seeming to glint in the flickering torchlight. Beyond these halls lay a smaller courtyard open to the sky, where a single awewit tree stood, its great roots pushing up through the stone paving. The air here smelled of earth and sap, and the only sound was the faint rustle of the trees, hanging needles in the evening breeze. At the far side, 2 guards parted without a word, letting him pass into a space so quiet it felt almost apart from the palace itself. The ruler's chamber was not large, but it was rich in detail, a floor covered in woven reed mats of intricate patterns, walls hung with feather mosaics that shimmered in the torchlight, and low cedar chests painted with the symbols of the Empire's gods. The Tlatoani was seated on a cushioned bench, his white cotton cloak edged with turquoise thread, a shallow jade bowl of cacao in his hands. He gestured for Xochipilli to sit across from him on a low mat. No advisors, no scribes, no priests, only the two of them in the muted light of the chamber. For a long moment, the ruler said nothing, his gaze fixed on Xochipilli in a way that felt both measuring and searching. "You've walked the palace without stumbling," he said at last, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of command. "You've carried words without asking their meaning, and you've spoken when it was necessary, not before." He set the jade bowl aside, the faint clink of it against the mat loud in the stillness. "Now I will ask you to watch more closely." What followed was less instruction than shaping a slow, deliberate outline of names, places, and patterns within the palace that Xochipilli was to notice, as if the ruler were pointing out the weave in a cloth only he could see. There were certain nobles whose moods mattered, certain priests whose silences were more telling than their speeches, certain visitors from the provinces whose gifts and requests carried meanings beyond their surface. "You will be near them," the ruler said, not as a servant, but as one they do not think to measure. It was not a request. When the audience ended, the Tlatoani rose, taking from a nearby chest a small obsidian mirror no larger than the palm of a hand. He held it out, and when Xochipilli took it, the stone's polished surface caught the torchlight in a way that made the reflected flame seem to tremble. "Keep this," the ruler said, "not to see yourself, but to remember that what you show is never the whole of what is seen." The walk back to his chambers felt longer than before, the weight of the mirror in his hand an anchor to the moment that had just passed. That night, he placed it beside his sleeping mat, where it caught the faintest spill of moonlight from the window. It reflected nothing clearly, only shapes and shadows, but he found himself looking into it again and again, as if the ruler's words might surface in its depth. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension. He was placed in rooms where conversations shifted when he entered, sent to deliver seemingly trivial objects to people whose reactions were far from casual, and asked to be present at feasts not to entertain, but to sit just close enough to overhear the low voices between more important exchanges. Each task left him with impressions, fleeting glances, tightened hands, a smile that did not reach the eyes that he carried back without commentary. No one asked him to explain them. The act of delivering the impressions was enough. Yet, with each assignment, the sense of a tether grew stronger, winding itself not only around his movements, but into his thoughts, until he could no longer walk the palace without wondering what unseen eyes were watching, and for what purpose they kept him so carefully in their gaze. The summons this time came not in words, but in the form of a cloak folded neatly at the foot of his sleeping mat when he awoke, its fabric far finer than anything he had worn before, dyed a deep, ceremonial red that seemed to drink in the dim morning light. There was no note, no messenger waiting to explain, but in the palace such a gift was never casual. The meaning was understood without being spoken. By mid-morning, a guard appeared to lead him through a series of passages he had never walked, their walls carved with scenes of celestial beings and star maps etched in gold leaf. The air grew cooler as they descended a short flight of steps, emerging into a long, low hall lit only by slivers of daylight filtering through narrow openings high in the walls. At the far end, the Tlatoani stood among a small gathering of high priests, their cloaks heavy with feathers, their faces painted in the black and white patterns reserved for rituals of the gods. In the center of the hall lay an altar of polished basalt, its surface inlaid with mother of pearl that caught the faint light and shimmered like water. Around it, on woven reed mats, sat several figures Xochipilli did not recognize men, and women whose bearing suggested both authority and secrecy. The guard gestured for him to stand at the edge of the circle, close enough to see, but not to touch. The air was thick with the scent of copal and crushed marigold petals, and beneath it, the faint metallic tang of blood. A low chant began, the voices of the priests rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to bend time, each note stretching into the next until the boundaries of the hall felt blurred, as though the walls themselves breathed with the sound. Into this chant, the Tlatoani spoke not loudly, but with the kind of quiet authority that made every ear bend toward him. His words wove between the names of gods and the names of men, between invocations of divine will and references to matters of tribute, alliance, and judgment. Xochipilli realized, as the chant continued beneath the ruler's voice, that this gathering was not only a ritual but a council, one in which the presence of the gods was invoked to sanction the decisions of the empire. When the Tlatoani's gaze flicked toward him, it was brief but deliberate, as if to remind him that what he saw here was to be carried only in memory and never in speech. A priest stepped forward to pour a thin stream of water over the altar, the droplets sliding across the pearl inlay like quicksilver. Another burned a small bundle of herbs, the smoke curling upward to mingle with the light. At one point, a sealed clay jar was brought forth and opened, releasing the scent of fermented cacao and offering both to the gods and, symbolically, to the earth itself. The gathering lasted until the shaft of light from the high wall had moved fully across the altar, a silent marker of the passage of time. When it ended, there was no formal dismissal. The participants simply rose and left in pairs or alone, their footsteps echoing softly in the dim hall. The guard who had brought Xochipilli led him back through the winding corridors without a word, but the weight of what he had witnessed seemed to follow him, settling into the quiet spaces of his mind like fine dust. That evening, as he sat in the garden with the scent of night-blooming flowers around him, Xochipilli appeared, leaning casually against a low stone wall. "They've let you see the blood beneath the flowers," he said, his voice carrying both warning and acknowledgement. "It means they want you to remember it, even when you're smiling." Xochipilli said nothing, but his fingers traced the edge of the red cloak folded beside him, feeling the fine weave, the softness that hid its strength. He understood now that his place in the palace was no longer defined solely by beauty or by the quiet errands he carried. It was becoming something more complex, a role that required him to witness without question, to remember without ever speaking, aloud. And though the flowers still bloomed in the gardens, and the music still drifted through the courtyards at night, he could not unsee the shimmer of pearl beneath the water, or the shadow it cast on the life he had once thought was only. A gilded cage doubt the change in how the palace regarded him was not immediate or announced, but it crept into the corners of his days like a slow mist over the lake, soft, almost invisible, until one noticed how far it had spread. Servants who once passed him with polite indifference now inclined their heads a fraction lower. Guards, at certain doorways, who used to study him with detached appraisal, began to step aside without a word, their eyes avoiding his. Even among the other concubines, there was a subtle shift. Conversations would quiet as he approached, and glances would pass between them that were neither hostile nor welcoming, but careful. He sensed that word, perhaps not of what he had seen, but of where he had been, had begun to circulate. The red cloak remained in his chamber, folded neatly beside the small obsidian mirror, and its presence seemed to mark him as something apart from his own circle. That morning, his duties were unremarkable. Arranging fresh mats in one of the reception halls, standing in the music room while visiting nobles admired the instruments, accompanying a steward to inspect offerings of fruit and flowers for in-flowers. Upcoming feast. Yet each interaction felt weighted, as though those around him were measuring not just his actions, but his silences. At midday, he was sent to deliver a sealed basket to the aviary, a task so ordinary it might have been meant. As a lull after the intensity of recent days, the aviary, with its riot of color and sound, had always been a place where he could find some measure of calm. Quetzals with tails like streams of green fire, scarlet macaws that screamed at the approach of strangers, small parrots with eyes as sharp as beads, all of them moved in a constant fluttering dance beneath the watch of the keepers. The baskets. Contents were simple: fresh figs and crushed maize, a treat for the birds. Yet as he set it down, one of the keepers, a man with weathered skin and eyes that missed nothing, leaned close enough for only Xochipilli to hear. "You walk different paths now," he murmured. "Be careful where they lead." He said nothing more, turning back to his work, as though the comment had never been made. That night, the Tlatoani held a small banquet in a side hall, a gathering of nobles from the western provinces. Xochipilli was placed not at the edge of the room, as would have been usual, but at the low table nearest the ruler, tasked with pouring cacao and ensuring the guests' cups were never empty. The air was warm with the scent of roasting maize and spiced turkey stew, the flicker of torches casting restless shadows across the painted walls. Conversation flowed easily at first, discussions of tribute shipments, weather patterns, the success of recent harvests, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of something more guarded. More than once, Xochipilli caught a guest's gaze lingering on him a moment too long, their expressions unreadable. He poured the cacao with steady hands, his eyes lowered, listening to the ebb and flow of voices. Certain phrases stood out: mention of unrest in a distant province, of a caravan delayed by flooding, of a priest whose absence from a ceremony had been noted but not explained. None of it was addressed to him, but all of it seemed to drift toward his ears, as though the placement of his seat had been chosen to gather these fragments. When the banquet ended, the ruler gave no sign that he had taken notice of Xochipilli, beyond the casual glance that accompanied his dismissal. Yet as he left the hall, one of the nobles brushed past him, their sleeve grazing his hand, and pressed into his palm a small folded scrap of a made paper. He kept walking, tucking it into the fold of his tonatli without looking at it until he was alone in his chamber. The message was brief: the one who knows the river knows the flood. No name, no signature, only a faint smell of copal clinging to the fibers. He read it twice, then placed it inside the cedar chest where he kept the mirror and the cloak. That night, as the palace settled into its slow-breathing sleep, he lay awake listening to the distant drums of the great temple. The sound was steady, unchanging, but he could not shake the feeling that its rhythm was no longer marking only the passage of time. It was marking the narrowing of the path before him, step by quiet step. The note remained in his cedar chest for 3 days, its faint scent of copal fading but never quite vanishing, like an echo that refuses to leave a room. Xochipilli did not speak of it to anyone, not even to Itzcoatl, though the older concubine's sharp eyes seemed to weigh him whenever they crossed paths, as if guessing that something had shifted. On the 4th morning, the meaning began to take shape. He was summoned not by the chief steward or the Tlatoani's attendants, but by one of the lesser palace scribes, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers who usually kept to the record rooms. "The ruler requests your presence in the southern gardens at midday," the scribe said, his voice low and steady, his eyes fixed on some point over Xochipilli's shoulder. The southern gardens were different from the ceremonial terraces where foreign visitors were received. They were more secluded, their pathways shaded by thick groves of ahuehuet and pomegranate, their fountains half hidden by climbing vines. At midday, the sun cast dappled light across the stone paths, and the air was rich with the mingled scents of damp earth and flowering magnolia. The Tlatoani was there, standing beside a long, shallow pool where orange and gold fish moved lazily beneath the surface. Without preamble, he began to speak, his tone conversational, but laced with an undercurrent that made each word feel like a stone placed carefully into a wall. "You have seen much of the palace," he said. "You have heard more than you have. Repeat it. Now you will go beyond it." He turned toward Xochipilli, his eyes narrowing slightly. "In 2 days' time, you will travel with a merchant caravan to the market at Azcapotzalco. You will carry no token of the palace, no sign of your role here. You will be a servant to the merchants, nothing more. You will return with them, and you will tell me who you saw, who you heard, and what the air in that place feels like." The phrasing was deliberate. What the air feels like, and Xochipilli understood it meant more than the weather. Azcapotzalco had once been the seat of power before the rise of Tenochtitlan, and though it was now under Mexico rule, the old pride of its people still ran deep. A journey there was not without risk for anyone tied to the palace, especially someone whose face might be remembered. He bowed his head, murmuring the only safe answer: "It will be as you say." The next 2 days passed in a haze of quiet preparation. A plain cotton cloak was provided for him, the weave coarse compared to the garments he usually wore. His hair was tied back without ornament, his telmatli draped to conceal the smoothness of his hands. At dawn on the appointed day, he joined the caravan at the city's northern causeway, a line of canoes laden with baskets of cacao, bundles of cloth, and cages of live turkeys that clucked and flapped as they were loaded. The journey across the lake was slow, the water lapping softly against the canoe's sides, the air alive with the cries of water birds, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. From time to time, he caught the merchants glancing at him, their expressions unreadable. Whether they knew his true purpose or not, they asked no questions. Azcapotzalco was smaller than Tenochtitlan, but no less alive. Its market was a tightly woven knot of sound and motion, stalls crammed together under awnings of woven reed, the air thick with the smells of roasting maize, fresh herbs, and the tongue of river fish laid out on woven mats. Xochipilli kept his head lowered, moving between the merchants' errands carrying baskets, delivering messages, waiting at the edges of haggling conversations. Yet all the while he listened. He heard talk of tribute demands increasing, of certain provinces slow to send their quotas, of a new alliance forming between two noble houses whose marriage feast was already being planned. In the shade of a stall selling obsidian blades, he overheard a pair of men discussing the movement of warriors along the northern causeway, their voices low and cautious. By the time the caravan prepared to leave, he had gathered enough fragments to know that the air here was heavy with something more than traded. It was thick with watchfulness, with conversations cut short when strangers drew near. The return journey was quiet, the lake's surface smooth as glass beneath the late afternoon sun. Back in the palace, he was brought directly to the southern gardens, where the Tlatoani awaited. He delivered his impressions without embellishment, his voice even, his gaze steady. The ruler listened without interrupting, and dismissed him with a nod. No praise, no sign of satisfaction, only the sense, as he walked away, that another thread had been tied to the growing web around him. That night, he took the folded note from the cedar chest and read it again. The one who knows the river knows the flood. And he wondered if Azcapotzalco had been the river, or if it was merely the first ripple of something larger yet to come. The flood announced itself not with a crash of water, but with the quiet erosion of the palace's usual rhythms. Conversations in the corridors that stopped abruptly when footsteps approached. Courtyards where familiar faces no longer lingered. Messages that took longer to arrive or arrived with the wrong seal, as if they had passed through too many hands. Xochipilli sensed it first in the gardens, where the daily tending of flowers and pools was suddenly accompanied by the presence of guards, who pretended to admire the magnolias while keeping their eyes on the shaded paths. In the aviary, the keepers whispered less, their voices falling into uneasy silence when anyone unfamiliar entered. At meals, even the softest banquets carried a brittle edge beneath the laughter, as though each guest was tasting more than the food. Itzcoatl found him one morning near the fountain in the eastern courtyard, where the water trickled over carved stone frogs, the sound soft enough to hide a low voice. "The river you saw at Azcapotzalco," he murmured. "Its waters are already here, and when they rise, they will not care who has learned to swim." He gave no further explanation, walking away before Xochipilli could ask. That afternoon, the chief steward summoned him, handing him a bundle of freshly woven mats, bound with a strip of red-dyed cotton. "Deliver these to the Hall of Feathers," he said, but there was a weight in his tone that made it sound like more than a simple errand. The Hall of Feathers, with its walls lined in mosaics of quetzal, macaw, and hummingbird plumes, was usually a place of quiet beauty, its artisans bent over their work, the air thick with the smell of beeswax and powdered shell pigment. But when Xochipilli entered, the usual hum of creation was gone. Instead, a group of nobles stood in a half-circle near the far wall, their voices low and their expressions tight. One of them glanced at him, then looked away quickly, as though his presence was an inconvenience they could not openly challenge. He placed the mats where instructed and left without speaking, but the image of their tense, clustered forms stayed with him. That night, in the concubine's quarters, an older attendant passed by his mat and dropped a folded strip of a mate, paper into his lap without slowing her step. The message was written in the same clean hand as the earlier note. "When the flood comes, the banks will be chosen before the waters arrive." He read it twice, then tucked it into the cedar chest beside the first, feeling the weight of words that said much without explaining anything at all. Over the next days, his assignments shifted in subtle but telling ways. He was sent to accompany visiting dignitaries through the palace, but instructed to take them along routes that avoided certain halls. He was told to remain in the music room during a feast, but seated so close to a conversation between two high-ranking warriors that their every word reached his ears. He noticed that the faces at the moon court were changing, some missing, replaced by others who seemed to speak less and listen more. One evening, during a small ceremony in the temple courtyard, the Tlatoani caught his gaze for a fraction longer than was necessary, and in that glance, Xochipilli sensed both warning and expectation. The air in the palace was shifting, thickening like the heavy calm before a storm. In the gardens, the magnolias still bloomed, the fountains still murmured, the birds in the aviary still called out to one another, but beneath it all, he could feel the unseen water rising, pressing against the walls, searching for a place to spill over. The breach, when it came, did not roar through the palace like a battle cry. It seeped in like water finding a crack in a wall, slow and quiet at first, then unstoppable once it had a path. Xochipilli felt it in the subtle disarray of the morning routine servants crossing paths in the corridors, carrying messages to places they normally avoided. Guards stationed at doorways that were usually unguarded. The chief steward's voice, sharper than usual, as he directed even the smallest errands. That morning he had been ordered to the Hall of Shells, not to deliver or retrieve anything, but simply to wait. The hall was cool and dim, the mother-of-pearl inlay catching the pale light that filtered through high windows. He sat on a woven mat near the wall, listening to the faint echo of footsteps somewhere beyond the corridor. When the door opened, it was not the steward or a noble who entered, but a cattle, his cloak damp from the mist that clung to the early air. He stood for a long moment, looking at Xochipilli, as though weighing how much to say. "It begins today?" he said quietly, stepping closer so his voice wouldn't carry. You will be asked to walk between two fires. You cannot pass without choosing which one will burn you less." Before Xochipilli could reply, the sound of approaching steps made a cattle straighten, his expression smoothing into neutrality. Two guards entered, their obsidian-tipped spears catching the light, and gestured for Xochipilli to follow. They led him not toward the central courtyards or the gardens, but to a narrow passage he had never seen, its walls painted with faded murals of water and reed boats, the colors dimmed by time. The passage opened into a small chamber where three men stood waiting. Two were advisors he had seen in the moon court, the third a warrior with a jaguar pelt draped over his shoulders, and the deep scar of a blade across his cheek. On the low table before them lay two objects, a sealed bundle wrapped in dyed cotton and a narrow strip of folded parchment. One of the advisors spoke first. "The ruler has instructed that the bundle be taken to the temple of Tlaloc before the midday drum. You will carry it, and you will not speak of it." His voice was measured, his eyes fixed steadily on Xochipilli's. Before he could answer, the other advisor gestured to the parchment. "But you will also take this," he said, "to the priest of Huitzilopochtli. It must arrive before the bundle reaches its destination. You will choose which to carry first." It was a test, and the weight of it pressed down like the humid air before rain. Both errands could not be completed without delay to one or the other, and in the delicate currents of palace politics, delay was as much a statement as delivery. Xochipilli bowed slightly, taking both items in his hands, feeling the faint roughness of the cotton bundle and the smooth, cool surface of the folded parchment. He left the chamber without a word, the guards watching him until he disappeared into the corridor. The palace seemed quieter than usual as he walked, his steps echoing off the stone. In the open courtyard between the two temples, he paused for a breath, his eyes moving from the rain god's stepped platform, dark against the sky, to the sun god's high altar where banners stirred faintly in the breeze. The choice felt heavy in his chest, not because of what he knew of the contents, he knew nothing, but because of what the order in which they were delivered might mean to the ones who had sent them. He turned toward the temple of Huitzilopochtli first, climbing the steep steps slowly, the drums above marking some smaller ritual already underway. The priest received the parchment without comment, only touching the folded strip to his forehead, before disappearing inside. From there, Xochipilli crossed the plaza toward the temple of Tlaloc, the bundle still tucked against his side. By the time he reached the steps, the midday drum had sounded, its deep voice rolling across the precinct. The priests of the rain god accepted the bundle with solemn nods, but their eyes flicked briefly toward the sun temple, as if marking the sequence of his path. When he returned to the palace, the advisors were gone, and no one questioned him about the errands. Yet in the days that followed, he felt the ripple of his choice in subtle ways. A glance that lingered too long from one noble, a message delayed from a steward, a shift in where he was seated at a banquet. It was the way the palace kept its scores, not in open rebukes or rewards, but in the small adjustments that slowly bent a person's place in the web. That night, a kettle found him in the gardens, where the scent of damp earth rose in the darkness. "You stepped toward the sun before the rain," he said softly, not as a question but as a statement. "There will be those who remember that, and those who will not forgive it." Then he was gone, his cloak vanishing into the shadows between the trees. Xochipilli sat alone for a long time, listening to the soft rush of the fountains, wondering if the fire he had chosen to approach truly burned less, or if the heat would only be felt when the water finally rose high enough to touch the flames. First signs of consequence came not as open accusation, but as the slow rearrangement of the air around him, the way currents shift beneath the lake's surface before a storm. Xochipilli noticed it in the absence of certain familiar faces servants, who had once greeted him with a quick smile, now passed by without meeting his gaze, their eyes fixed on the ground. The guards at the smaller gates, who had always let him pass with a nod, now took an extra heartbeat to step aside, their hands tightening briefly on the shafts of their spears. In the moon court, two of the older advisors who had once spoken to him directly now seemed to discuss matters over his shoulder, as though he were no longer quite in the circle, but hovering just outside it. It was not banishment, not yet more like the subtle narrowing of a path, each turn pressing closer, making it harder to walk without brushing the walls. That week, his assignments grew strangely sparse. Instead of the carefully chosen errands that had marked his days for months, he was sent to tend to ceremonial rooms in the palace's quieter wings, far from the hum of political exchange. The rooms themselves were silent and immaculate floors of smooth stone, walls painted with faded scenes of rivers, gods, and long-forgotten battles, but their stillness felt less like peace and more like exile. He moved through them alone, dusting feather mosaics, straightening woven mats, refilling small clay bowls of incense that no one seemed to light. It was here, in one of these quiet halls, that Xochipilli appeared unexpectedly. His expression was unreadable as he leaned in the doorway, watching Xochipilli adjust the placement of a ceremonial drum. "They've cooled the water around you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's what they do when they want to see if you'll float without the currents." When Xochipilli asked what that meant, Xochipilli only shrugged. "Some want to see you rise. Others want to see you sink. Best not to let either think they've decided for you." Then he was gone again, leaving the scent of his cloak's woven cotton faintly in the air. 2 days later, he was summoned to the outer gardens for what seemed, at first, an ordinary task escorting a visiting noblewoman from the coastal provinces through the palace grounds. The woman, wrapped in a sea-green cloak embroidered with silver thread, walked slowly, her gaze lingering on the fountains and flowering trees, asking polite questions about the plants and the view of the lake. But as they neared the shaded walkway beside the aviary, her voice lowered almost to a murmur. "In my city," she said, "when the rain comes late, the people speak of who held back the clouds." Her eyes met his briefly before she turned to admire a flowering vine, as though the remark had been nothing more than idle poetry. That night, Xochipilli found another note waiting on his sleeping mat, written in the same clean, deliberate hand as the earlier messages. It read, "The flood remembers the first stone it touched." He tucked it into the cedar chest with the others, the faint smell of copal still clinging to the fibers, and wondered if this was a warning, a reminder, or both. The following morning, a new summons came not from the steward, but from a priest of Talok himself. The meeting was to take place at the temple's lower courtyard, a place of deep shadows where the air was heavy with the scent of wet stone, and offerings of maize and flowers floated in shallow basins. The priest greeted him with the formal courtesy reserved for palace messengers, but there was a stiffness in his tone. "You carried a bundle for us last week," he said, "and you chose to arrive after the sun had been served." His eyes, dark and unblinking, searched Xochipilli's face. "The rain does not forget the order of its coming." The conversation ended there, but its weight followed Xochipilli back through the corridors, a steady pressure against the back of his thoughts. In the days that followed, his isolation deepened. Meals were quieter, the other concubines' laughter distant. In the moon court, his position was shifted a few paces farther from the center. Yet even as the distance grew, he sensed another kind of attention, one more hidden, but no less present. He would catch sight of the ruler's gaze on him across a hall, not lingering, but sharp enough to suggest that his every step was still being measured. It was in this strange half-light, neither fully trusted nor fully cast aside, that Xochipilli began to understand the true nature of survival in the palace. It was not only about beauty, or obedience, or even discretion. It was about learning to navigate the invisible currents, to ride them when they carried you forward, and to find stillness when they pulled away, without ever letting the surface see you struggle. That night, lying beneath the faint creak of the reed mat, he thought of the fires Xochipilli had spoken of, and the water that now seemed to lap at their edges, carrying with it the memory of every choice he had made, the first open sign of fracture. Between the sun and the rain came not in the great halls where the Tlatoani received foreign dignitaries, nor in the moon court's whispered councils, but in the less regarded spaces where the palace's life quietly flowed, the storerooms, the servants' walkways, the narrow gardens that connected one wing to another. Xochipilli felt it in the knee. Way two stewards each aligned, he suspected, with different powers past one another without speaking, their shoulders stiff, their eyes fixed ahead as if the other were invisible. He saw it in the sudden doubling of guards at certain thresholds, their obsidian-tipped spears angled slightly inward rather than outward, a subtle gesture that meant they were as much there to watch those within as to guard against those without. Even in the aviary, once a place of noise and color, a subdued tension seemed to coil through the air. The keepers whispered less, their eyes darting toward the entrances more often than toward the birds. The birds. One morning, while tending the feathered cloaks in the Hall of Feathers, he overheard two artisans speaking in low tones about a shipment of tribute from the coastal provinces that had been delayed without explanation. "The rain waits at the border," one said, his voice tight, "and the sun pretends not to see the clouds." The phrase was nothing more than a metaphor to an outsider, but here it was a pointed observation, wrapped in imagery to pass unnoticed by the uninitiated. That afternoon, Xochipilli was summoned to attend a small private feast hosted by the Tlatoani, with only a handful of high-ranking guests present. He was placed at a low-side table, tasked with pouring cacao and replenishing the trays of roasted maize and turkey. The conversation at the main table began in the usual polite tones, but soon the undercurrent surfaced. A noble from the Rain faction, his cloak dyed, deep blue and embroidered with waves, spoke pointedly of the need to prepare the city's reservoirs before the summer rains, a matter clearly under his sphere of influence. Almost immediately, a Sun faction representative, wearing a mantle of bright yellow macaw feathers, countered by shifting the topic to the upcoming festival in honor of Huitzilopochtli, a celebration that would demand resources and attention of its own. Their words remained civil, but the rhythm of their exchange carried the force of two currents meeting head-on, each refusing to yield. Xochipilli kept his eyes lowered, moving between tables with the steady grace expected of him, but he could feel the weight of the moment settling into the air like heavy humidity before a storm. When the feast ended, the ruler dismissed the guests with the same calm smile he always wore. But as Xochipilli poured the last of the cacao into the jade cup, he noticed the Tlatoani's fingers tap once against the table, an absent gesture. To most, but in the palace, it was often the sign of a decision being made. The next morning, the chief steward summoned him with a task unlike any he had been given before. He was to carry two messages, one to the high priest of Tlaloc, the other to the commander of the Eagle Warriors. The instructions were precise not only in the delivery order, but in the route he was to take, which wound through both public courtyards and secluded corridors. As he moved through the palace, he felt the eyes of guards and servants alike following him, each perhaps trying to guess the meaning of his errand. At the Temple of Tlaloc, the priest received the message with a solemn nod, his eyes lingering on Xochipilli's face for a moment before turning away. At the Eagle Warriors' quarters, the commander broke the seal on the message immediately, scanning its contents before folding it again with deliberate slowness. "Tell him," the commander said, his voice low and even, "that the wings will not fold in the rain." Xochipilli carried the words back, though he was never asked to repeat them aloud. That night, the Moon Court convened, and for the first time he saw the factions seated not in their usual scattered arrangement, but in two distinct clusters, the space between them like a narrow, untraversed channel. The ruler spoke little, allowing the advisors and priests to circle their arguments, but his gaze moved often between the two groups, measuring, weighing. Xochipilli's place was, as always, at the edge, but he knew now that edges could be dangerous. They were where the water lapped hardest when the flood came. After the council dispersed, a cattle appeared beside him, his voice low. "You've walked between them," he said. "Soon you'll be asked to carry something that will tilt the balance. And when that happens, it won't be enough to walk carefully. You'll, have to decide where you want the water to break." Xochipilli said nothing, but as he returned to his chamber, the words coiled in his mind like a serpent waiting to strike. That night, the distant drums of the great temple sounded slower than usual, their beat like the measured breath of something vast, awake, and waiting. The moment the cattle had warned him about arrived not with a dramatic summons, but with a request, so simply delivered that, for a heartbeat, Xochipilli might have mistaken it for one of his earliest errands before he understood that in the palace, the smallest tasks could hold the greatest weight. It was just after dawn when a young page appeared at the concubine's quarters, his hair still damp from washing, his tonately plain and unadorned. He carried a small lacquered box, no larger than a man's hand, wrapped in a strip of woven, cotton dyed a pale yellow that caught the morning light like a trapped sunbeam. "You are to take this to the western gate," the page said, reciting the words as though they had been drilled into him, "and place it in the hands of the one who will greet you there. You will know him by the feathers at his belt." There was no seal, no name, no explanation. Xochipilli took the box, feeling the smooth lacquer under his fingers, the faint rattle of something shifting within. As he stepped into the cool corridors of the waking palace, he noticed the unusual quiet, not the gentle calm of morning, but a silence edged with expectation, as though the walls themselves knew where he was going. The western gate was not often used for ceremonial processions. It was a point of entry and exit favored for more discreet movements, traders bringing tribute, messengers leaving at odd hours, priests visiting from distant temples. The path there wound through shaded courtyards and narrow walkways where the air held the mingled scents of damp stone, crushed herbs, and the faint sweetness of early blossoming flowers. Halfway to his destination, a figure stepped from a side passage to block his way, a man in a deep blue cloak embroidered with stylized waves. His face was calm, but his eyes were fixed sharply on the box in Xochipilli's hands. "That is not for the sun to carry," the man said quietly, though his tone carried more warning than accusation. "If it reaches the gate, the clouds will break and the rain will come harder than they are ready for." He held out his hand, palm up. "Give it to me, and I will see that it rests where it belongs." For a long moment, Xochipilli stood still, the box warm against his palm, despite the cool morning air. He knew the man was of the rain faction. The waves stitched into his cloak told him that much. And he knew, too, that to hand over the box would be to shift the balance in one direction, just as surely as delivering it to the western gate would tilt it in the other. He thought of a cattle's words, of walking between fires, of water finding its banks. Slowly, he stepped back, his gaze steady. "I was told who to give it to," he said softly, "and I will know him by the feathers at his belt." The man's eyes narrowed, but he did not move to block him again. "Then remember," he said, his voice dropping lower, "the flood spares no one who opens its gates." Xochipilli continued on, the sound of his own footsteps loud in the stillness. At the gate, a guard in plain dress awaited, a belt of woven leather at his waist from which hung 3 small feathers, one yellow, one red, one white. He accepted the box without a word, turned, and vanished into the shadows beyond the wall. On the walk back, Xochipilli felt the weight of what had passed, not just the choice itself, but the fact that it had been seen. In the palace, eyes were everywhere, and the story of that morning would travel along unseen channels before the sun reached its highest point. By the time he returned to his chamber, a note lay on his mat. It was written in the same deliberate hand as the others. The bank you choose is the bank you must stand on when the waters rise. He folded it and placed it with the rest in the cedar chest, the faint smell of copal clinging to the fibers. That evening, the moon court convened, and for the first time in weeks, the ruler's gaze lingered on him, not long enough for others to notice, but long enough for Xochipilli to understand that his choice had been marked. Whether it had pleased or displeased the Tlatoani, he could not yet tell. But he knew this. The waters were still rising, and now he was no longer merely drifting between their currents. He was standing on one bank, watching the flood draw near. The breaking of the flood began quietly, as all things in the palace seemed to, without the clang of battle or the shout of open challenge, but with a shift in the air that settled over every courtyard and corridor like an invisible mist. Xochipilli felt it in the change of pace, the way footsteps seemed quicker, conversation shorter, as if everyone carried some urgent and hidden task. Even the birds in the aviary seemed unsettled, their calls sharper and more frequent, wings rustling against the confines of their cages. On the second morning after delivering the lacquered box to the western gate, the signs became impossible to miss. Guards in the colors of both sun and rain factions appeared in places they had never stood before, at the entrances to storerooms, on balconies overlooking the courtyards, even outside the kitchens, their spears angled casually, but unmistakably toward one another. Servants moved in pairs, rather than alone, eyes flicking over their shoulders as they carried baskets of food or jars of water. The moon court did not convene that night, a rare and telling absence. Instead, smaller gatherings occurred in shadowed halls, voices kept low, with only the occasional name or place audible before the sound of footsteps scattered them apart. It was in one of these dim side corridors that Xochipilli found him, the lines around his mouth deeper than usual. "It has begun?" he said simply, falling into step beside Xochipilli as they walked. "The sun has sent its reach into places the rain thought secure, and the rain has answered in kind. The next days will decide more than who sits closer to the ruler. They will decide who walks these halls at all when it is done." His tone carried no drama, only the steadiness of someone who had seen such tides before. That evening, Xochipilli was given a task that made his pulse tighten in his throat. The chief steward called him to a small chamber off the Hall of Shells, where a table held a single rolled mat bound with a strip of plain leather. "This is to be taken to the temple of Tlaloc tonight," the steward said, his eyes fixed on Xochipilli with the weight of unspoken meaning. "You will carry it alone. If you are stopped, you have not seen it before." The mat was light in his hands, but its presence seemed to grow heavier with each step he took through the winding corridors. The palace was quieter than usual at this hour, the torchlight pooling in long shadows that swayed with the faint draft of the night air. Halfway to the temple, in the narrow walkway beside the outer gardens, he was stopped not by a guard, but by a man in the bright yellow and red of the sun faction. "The path to the rain is closed tonight," the man said, his voice polite but firm. "Give me the mat, and I will see that it is delivered in the morning." His hand extended, palm open, the gesture deceptively casual. Xochipilli felt the smooth leather strap warm against his fingers, the silence between them stretching. He knew that to hand it over would be to undo whatever the Rain faction intended, and that refusing could make him a direct target for the sun's retribution. Slowly, he stepped back, the mat still in his grip. "I was told it must arrive tonight," he said, keeping his voice low and even. The man's expression did not change, but his eyes hardened slightly. "Then walk quickly," he replied, stepping aside. "The water rises faster in the dark." Xochipilli moved on without looking back, his pace steady, though his heart beat like the distant drums from the great temple. At the temple of Tlaloc, the priests took the mat from his hands without a word, their faces unreadable in the flickering torchlight. On his way back, he passed the same walkway, now empty, the shadows deeper than before. By the time he reached his chamber, another note lay on his mat. "The flood does not stop at the banks, it seeks the highest ground." He folded it into the cedar chest with the others, the smell of copal stronger this time, as if the message itself had been steeped in incense. Sleep came slowly, the creak of the reed mat above him, blending with the faint echo of footsteps in the corridors beyond. He knew now that the quiet was ending, and that soon the palace would no longer pretend its walls were whole. The waters were breaking through, and when they did, there would be no dry place left to stand. The confrontation, when it finally surfaced, did so not with shouts or clashing weapons, but with a tightening of the air so sharp that every sound in the palace seemed to carry twice as far, every movement watched for more than one pair of eyes. By dawn, Xochipilli could feel it in the way the palace stirred servants moving faster than usual, their tilmatlis hastily tied, guards posted, not only at the grand entrances, but at inner thresholds that rarely saw such vigilance. In the gardens, the fountains still poured, the flowers still opened to the morning sun, yet the pathways between them were lined with pairs of soldiers in different colors, blue and green for the rain faction, yellow and red for the sun. Each group stood just far enough from the other to keep their hands off their weapons, but close enough for their eyes to lock in unblinking challenge. The moon court did not meet that night or the night before. Instead, small, tense gatherings were happening everywhere, in the Hall of Shells, in the side rooms of the aviary, even in the kitchens, where hushed voices competed with the chopping of herbs and the pounding of maize. Xochipilli was summoned in the late morning by the chief steward, whose usually smooth voice now carried the clipped tone of a man pressed from all sides. "You will attend the ruler today," he said. "You will remain in the Hall of Mirrors until dismissed, and you will not leave for any reason." The order seemed simple, but the choice of place was deliberate. The Hall of Mirrors was both a sanctuary and a testing ground, a chamber where every polished surface reflected not just the people within, but the tensions between them. When Xochipilli entered, the ruler was already there, seated at the far end, his white cloak luminous against the dark obsidian walls. To the right stood members of the Sun faction, their colors vivid even in the dim light. To the left, the Rain faction, their blues and greens deep as the waters they claimed. Between them, the space was empty, a strip of smooth stone where no one stepped. The ruler's gaze moved from one side to the other as the conversation began, each group pressing its grievances with careful words that concealed sharper edges. Tribute routes were discussed, whether the grain from the northern provinces should be stored first in the Sun faction's granaries or directed to the reservoirs favored by the rain. The allocation of warriors for upcoming campaigns was argued, with the same measured civility, yet every exchange left the space between them feeling narrower, heavier. Xochipilli stood near the back, silent, his eyes lowered, but his ears open. He caught the way one Sun faction advisor's voice dropped when speaking of the recent delivery to the Temple of Tlaloc, the way a Rain faction priest's hands tightened around his staff at the mention of the Western Gate. Every small shift in tone was a drop in the growing flood. At one point, the ruler turned his gaze toward Xochipilli and asked a question so casually it might have been mistaken for idle curiosity. "When you walked the gardens yesterday, what did you see?" He answered with care, describing the blooms, the fountains, the calm surface of the pools, leaving unsaid the lines of guards, the silent watchers in the shadows. The ruler's eyes lingered on him for a moment, longer than necessary, then moved on. By the time the meeting ended, the factions had agreed on nothing. The ruler dismissed them without visible frustration, but the silence that followed their departure was telling. That evening, as Xochipilli made his way back to the concubine's quarters, a cattle intercepted him under the shadow of a low archway. "The banks are breaking," he murmured, "and you are standing where the water will run fastest." Before Xochipilli could reply, a guard appeared, summoning him again, this time not to the Hall of Mirrors, but to the western gardens, where the faint glow of torches lit a scene that made his pulse tighten. Two men, one in the colors of the sun and one of the rain, stood facing each other with drawn blades, the air between them trembling with the tension of an unstruck blow. Around them, other soldiers from both factions waited, hands on their weapons, eyes darting toward the palace walls, as if expecting orders to come spilling from them. Xochipilli was led past them into a smaller, walled garden where the ruler waited alone. "You will carry a message," the Tlatoani said, pressing a sealed strip of amate paper into his hand. "It will go to the moon court, and you will place it only in the hands of the high priest. Do not read it. Do not let it out of your sight." His voice was calm, but in it was the weight of a man who knew the flood had already entered his house. As Xochipilli moved through the torchlit corridors, the sealed strip warm in his hand, he realized that whatever it contained would not stop the waters. It would only decide who would stand on which bank when they reached their height. And in that moment, he understood fully that there was no path left that did not lead through the flood itself. The flood did not come with a single moment of chaos, no clash of warriors in the courtyards or cries echoing through the halls, but with a slow, steady rising that seemed almost gentle, until one noticed how much of the palace it had already covered. Xochipilli carried the ruler's sealed message through corridors where the torchlight flickered strangely, as if the air itself were shifting. In some hallways, guards stood in doubled ranks, their eyes following him without expression. In others, there was no one at all, the emptiness more unsettling than the crowded spaces. The path to the moon court felt longer than he remembered, each turn bringing the faint echo of distant footsteps or the rustle of fabric against stone. When he reached the courtyard, the high priest was already waiting beneath the carved serpents. Head, his face painted in the solemn black and white of ceremony. Xochipilli placed the message in his hands, feeling the cool press of the priest's fingers close briefly over his own. No words were spoken. The priest turned away, vanishing into the shadowed chamber beyond, and the courtyard fell silent except for the soft drip of water from the serpent's mouth into the pool. As he retraced his steps, the palace seemed different, as if every sound, every flicker of movement was part of some pattern he had not been taught to see. He passed the aviary, where the birds were restless, wings beating against the bars, bright feathers floating to the floor like the petals of flowers shaken, loose by wind. In the gardens, the fountains still ran, but their water was cloudy, the reflections on their surface breaking and reforming in a slow, uneasy rhythm. Near the Hall of Mirrors, he saw a cattle for what he knew would be the last time. The older man stood half in shadow, watching him with that same unreadable gaze he had worn since their first meeting. "It is done," a cattle said quietly, "and now the water will go where it was always meant to."